Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF, and I want to welcome you to an event this morning on the question of does productivity still benefit average American workers? And this is a report that Steve Rose, who's a colleague of ITIF's, longtime colleague, has written for us and was releasing today. It's an update of a report he did probably just 5-6 years ago. 2007, longer than that. And it's incorporated new data, so Steve will talk about that. Before I introduce the panel, though, let me just make a few framing remarks. It seems that on this question of does technology and productivity still benefit people, that we've really fallen into this dangerous groupthink narrative in the country. You see that today, for example, the front page of the New York Times. And anybody saw that story on robotics and automation and technology? It's a story that basically the narrative is that automation and productivity are leading to mass joblessness. Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, was quoted as saying that he no longer believes that automation would always create jobs. This isn't some hypothetical future possibility. It's emerging right now. If it's emerging right now, then why has productivity grown only 6.5% over the last 5 years? It's sort of the most dismal productivity performance we've had in decades. It doesn't seem like evidence of a mass technology revolution. If it's emerging right now, why is the unemployment rate lower than any time before the Great Recession? It's possible. Could it be possible that analysis and data are simply ignored now on these critical economic policy debates? We see this in the same area with regard to the question of income inequality and who benefits from productivity. It's now almost a uniform consensus among the right, among the left, everybody, that productivity simply doesn't benefit average workers anymore. And the only debate on that is whether the average worker gets nothing, which many people have believed, or they get a little bit. And I think, as you'll see today from Steve's really strong analysis, that's just simply wrong. That productivity still benefits workers. It could benefit them more, but it still benefits them. So why does this matter? Why are we having this debate? Why are we having this discussion? It matters because if we're going to develop a policy framework and support for pro-growth policies, then we have to have a reason why we want pro-growth policies. If we believe that pro-growth policies are going to put people out of work and only accrue to the rich, why would we bother doing that? And I think getting this narrative right, that technology and productivity actually still benefit people, average people, working people, is a key component in ensuring that we get the policy framework right. So we have a great panel this morning. Our main presenter is Steve Rose, who's a research professor at George Washington University Institute of Public Policy. Steve is a nationally recognized labor economist. He's been doing research and writing about social class in America for over 30 years. His book, Social Stratification in the U.S., was originally published in 1978, and its 7th edition is out in about 2 months.
Actually, released it officially today.
Oh, you need to update your bio.
Oh, okay. They took me by surprise.
I gotta get a copy.
I only have one.
Only one. This is a story about the 1%. Only you did that. He's also written a wonderful book. You haven't read it, Rebound: Why America Will Emerge Stronger from the Financial Crisis. He's held senior positions at Georgetown, Educational Testing Service, U.S. Department of Labor, Joint Economic Committee, and others. And everybody on this panel this morning, it's a wonderful panel, has a PhD. Steve's PhD is from City University of New York.
Not that that counts for a grade.
And I added up all of the books we've all written, and there were 20 books on the panel at least. So it's just on book weight alone. You should take what we all say quite seriously. Gary, I'm going to introduce. I assume Gary is coming. Maybe he got held up by the traffic. Gary Bertles is a senior fellow in the Economic Studies group at Brookings. Long time scholar in questions around income distribution and poverty, labor markets and social insurance, and others. He's co-authored or he's written a number of books, co-authored 5 years after the long-term effects of welfare to work programs, growth with equity, et cetera, and many, many other books. He's written numerous scholarly articles on labor market issues, income distribution, and others. And Gary also has a PhD. But it doesn't say that. And lastly, Rui Teixeira, a longtime colleague who really needs no introduction if you follow this space. He's a senior fellow at both the Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress. He was also a guest scholar at Brookings. And he's written a number of books, the New Swing Region, Changing Politics and Demographics in the Mountain West, the future of Red, Blue, and Purple America, the Future of Election Demographics, and his book, The Emerging Democratic Majority with John Judas, was the most widely discussed book of the year when it came out. And he's written a number of other really interesting articles about how the emerging populace and demographics are changing and what that means for American politics. And Rui also holds a PhD from University of Wisconsin. So with that, Steve?
Thank you.
It's obviously, that's a little loud. It's obviously appropriate to be talking about this because it's always discussed lately. Just over the weekend, the Washington Post started its 7-part series on the lost middle class. On Sunday also, the New York Times had a piece said, "Is it bad enough yet?" But the conclusion was, people are finally fed up. The focus was given a shot in the arm by the runaway bestseller Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. And in much of the research on the issue, data from him and his American colleague Emmanuel Sace are cited over many times. And oftentimes when they're not cited, they cite someone else who rely on Piketty and Sace data. So I'm going to try and discuss that. In my own life, concerns about inequality have played a big role. As a youngster, like many youngsters, I wanted to pursue social change. And although most people might not think getting a PhD in economics was the most direct route to this goal, I viewed it as getting my union card to teach and went into community organizing and teaching in Baltimore after I finished my graduate coursework. In 1978, after being in a lot of debates about community organizing and how to make social change, I produced the first poster, Social Stratification in the U.S. It came out in December 1978. This is the 7th edition. As I said, that's released today. And, Kramer Books usually carries it, so if it was released today, it might be there. But they only sent me a couple of copies. And basically, obviously, I start with the notion of, I wrote about inequality in '79 and thought it was bad, and today it's obviously worse. So there are changes, but the issue is going to be how big those changes are and what they mean. On the political front, people are finally fed up with the economy and obviously want change. Well, gee, look what happened to the Democrats. Particularly at the state level, people didn't vote for the party that cared about inequality, but voted for the party that advocated lower taxes and regulation as a way to get economic growth. Even among those, so there were 5 states in which there were minimum wage referendum on the ballots, all in Republican-leaning states, and they passed with about 70% of the vote. And 1/3 of the people who voted for increasing the minimum wage to help low earners voted for the Republican candidate. And I'll discuss that at the end, how one squares that circle. But the bottom line is that there's a disconnect between politics and economics. You know, that one would think. So there's 2 ways to explain this potential disconnect. Probably more, but you know, the one way is to say that people are making mistakes when they're voting for Republicans because they're voting against their interests. The Republicans help the rich. The Republicans help not only perpetuate but increase inequality. So if you believe in some version of we are the 99%, and we are the 99% and the Republicans support the 1%, the notion that people would be voting for the group that supports the 1% seems hard to believe, so therefore you just deny it, that they're making a mistake. They should vote it. Or the analysis that I will present today is that their economics is a bit messed up, and people aren't on the edge of subsistence, etc., and they're not in dire shapes. That said, what I will say is inequality is up, but not as much as presented by Piketty and Sates and cited over and over again. In particular, the key numbers of Piketty and Sates are, that's cited over and over again, and you can do different time periods. One commonly cited time period is 79 to 2007. So you're using that period to avoid saying that this is just because of the Great Recession. That this occurred before the Great Recession. It reflects structural change in the economy that needs changing, and the recession made it worse. So their numbers are, and these numbers, as I will discuss shortly, are based on IRS records, and I'll discuss the strengths and weaknesses of that. So they look at the top 10% and variation and gradations within the top 10%, especially the top 1% and gradations within the top 1%. And the IRS data are particularly good for this. They're really the best data on this. And they argue that the top 1% between 1979 and 2007 got 59% of the growth. And what that meant is that when you count in the next 9%, who got more of it, also got a share of the growth, the bottom 90% of Americans in their data got simply 9% of the growth. So 90% of the people got 9% of the growth, which meant that their average standard of living from 79 to 2007 increased by 5%. So they're saying that people, even in the upper middle class, between the 81st and the 90th percentile, the ones that live out in Northern Virginia, etc., they hardly saw any growth either. By contrast, the Congressional Budget Office has done a very elaborate analysis, combining IRS records with what's called current population survey records to get a much wider scope of income. And for them, what they find, and they're what I would argue more appropriate way to look at economic income and more comprehensive, they find that the bottom 90% didn't get 59% of the growth.
No, 9%.
The bottom 90% didn't get 9% of the growth, they got 59% of the growth. And at the median, Piketty and Sates don't break out the median, at the median, the gain of after tax, that is what's spendable income by people, was up 50%. So basically you have up 5 versus up 50. It's obviously a much different view of what you would think politics would be. Now that said, remember, the bottom 90 got 59% of the growth, the top 10 got 41% of the growth, so inequality increased. And certainly, there can be no question that the billion-dollar salaries and the notion of the number of billionaires is offensive. I mean, it's just hard to believe that they care about money anymore. I mean, for them, it's really just a game. That is, the game is to just make more money because then you're higher on some totem pole, because it certainly doesn't affect their lifestyle. So there's no question, it's pretty bizarre that they're now building 50,000 square foot houses. There was 90,000 square foot houses. It's just bizarre. But that said, one should not forget that what matters is what happens to middle class people, and I'll discuss that more a little later.
Steve, did you see the diamond watch on the back page of the New York Times this morning, which I'm buying for my wife for Christmas? It's all diamond inlaid, and I think everybody can afford that.
How much was it?
They didn't have a price, which tells you something. Tells you something right there.
There it is right
There
there.
it is. See if you got it. There you go. Okay.
There it is. There's the watch. Steve's wife wants one.
So, what I will argue then is economic hardship that would drive people to want to vote Democrat and would not drive them to vote Republican is limited to the bottom 25%. And that if you think about what the Democrats have done over the last 6 years under the Obama administration of any significance, ACA, Obamacare, the minimum wage, and immigration are really policies that are aimed at the bottom 25%. It's reasonable to do that, but then, you should understand that it's not like the middle class feels that they are directly benefiting and enthusiastically support this such that it would drive what they vote. It's not benefiting them, and there are reasons to do it, but they may be worrying that their taxes may be going up, and they may be worrying that government is doing this and the bureaucracies are not, going to be that effective. And the bottom line is, in the back of their mind, there's no question that a disproportionate share of low-income people are minorities, and they are less deserving victims. So it should not come as a surprise that middle-class people are up for grabs. That is, they don't have an interest to vote either Republican or Democrat. They have an interest to see an economy grow, and they think they'll get part of that share. When we talk about economic growth, it's important to say, what is it? I mean, economic growth seems like it should be so important. Well, not in America. It's not something like a life-changing effect of moving from poverty to the middle class, but really the acquisition of more and better amenities for the great majority of the population. Across the board, everything is bigger and better. Houses, cars, there are appliances. Again, talking about what's advertised in the New York Times, virtually every day they have either Thermador or Bosch get your kitchen with all these appliances, because in the paper I talk about in some depth, go over how every kind of commodity has changed, and this is based on another study that should be coming out shortly from the Georgetown Center on Education and Workforce, where not only I talk about what has changed and how we have changed from consuming less on food and clothing to more on healthcare, recreation, and personal business services. This is what we consume more of. Where personal business services are insurance, banking, etc., real estate agents, accounting, legal affairs, and paying your bills and whatever. So another thing. So the other thing that should also be noticed is obviously clothing is now more not simply about necessity, but about features and styles. We're living healthier. All this expenditure on healthcare. They just announced that once again our longevity is up, and it turns out that older people are healthier before they die. We're living longer and we're living healthier. And in terms of education, you hear again a lot of these stories about education, but in data in the Digest on Educational Statistics, the dropout rate has declined dramatically for Hispanics and blacks over the last 15 years. The share of blacks and Hispanics going to post-secondary education and the share of young people in general going directly from high school to post-secondary education is at record levels. The education system is having people move on. But now let's turn to the income data. All of the stuff that's discussed in the paper that shows how much we're consuming more and how much the internet and the computer have changed how we shop and changed how we interact, and none of that was around in 79. The IBM PC came out in 81. So when we're talking about 79 to 2007, we are talking about pre-computer, widespread computer, let alone cell phone, let alone tablets, etc., etc. To illustrate, so if we look at income data and what drives this thing, there are three main sources: the current population survey, Piketty and States, and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. If we look at the bottom quintile and ask what is the average income of people in the bottom quintile of these three sources, it's just $2,000 in Piketty and States. So the bottom 20% supposedly only have $2,000. It's not right. I'll explain why. On CPS, it's $12,000 in cash income, and in CBO, it's $24,000. 2, 12, 24. At the median of the three sources, the median in Piketty and States that they don't report is $30,000. In CPS, it's $53,000 now, and in CBO, excuse me, this is 2010 data, 2007 data, to be consistent, it's $78,000.
For everybody, not the bottom 20%.
Yes, the median income of the whole population. So in Piketty and States, it's 30, in CBO, it's 77,700. So I'm going to focus on use CBO to criticize Piketty and States because, as Rob noted, it's so cited, it's so taken for granted that this is what's been happening. So in paper, I go over in a lot of detail. So why is it that it's $2,000? How can the bottom 20% be living on $2,000? Well, one is that Piketty and States uses the IRS data, and the IRS data basically has the. So what we know is that there are about 120 million households in America. In Piketty and States' data, they use tax filers, and there are 157 million tax filers. So they have an extra 37, I think it's rounded to 36 million tax filers, and they're mainly low-income people. These are young people who don't want to be on their parents, and sometimes wives who don't want to be on their husband's taxes. So they have many more young people. And the second thing they do is that they don't want to deal with transfer payments at all. A thing that most people aren't aware of Piketty and States is that they exclude income. That is income that people have, cash income that people have. They're only dealing with what's called market income. They don't count it. They take it out. So in Piketty and States, they have basically 15 million. They have 15 million households that have zero income. Not that they have no cash. They just have zero income in their reporting. And this is why they get such a low number for the bottom 20%. And it drives everything down in Piketty and States. And the notion of what should transfers be dealt with, I deal a lot with in the paper because Jared Bernstein had made a big deal that transfers were driving income gain and therefore it didn't matter in CBO. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake. And that is, what's happening is that elderly people are getting a lot more transfer income, and what's happening is that the middle class, the middle quintile, is composed of two groups: the elderly and the non-elderly. The elderly are getting all these extra transfer payments. And in CBO, they count health care benefits that you don't pay for as part of your income. So therefore, they add, when everyone who has Medicare gets an extra $10,000 in income because they're consuming those resources if they had to buy that insurance. So basically, as we spend more on health care, many more elderly people have moved into the third income quintile. So the share is shot up from about 10 to 30% of the third income quintile. And therefore, they have high transfer payments, and it looks like the average transfer payments of the group, which Bernstein focuses on, have gone up a lot, and that explains the growth. But in fact, it's what statisticians call the fallacy of composition. There's two groups. One group has a lot, and the other group doesn't. So what it looks like is that earnings haven't gone up a lot, because there are more elderly people in the middle quintile that Bernstein focuses on, and they have zero earnings. So earnings go down because of these people, and transfer payments look like they're high because these people have it and these people don't. And that doesn't reflect the thing, and you can see that if you look at non-elderly households. So the other thing that differs, as I've already said, is not only are the economists have this view that income should be resources that you consume plus change in wealth. So the definition of income in economists speak is resources consumed plus change in wealth. So P&S, Piketty and Sates, and CBO account for capital gains as part of it, of income, because that's a change in wealth. It's not a very good indicator of change in wealth, but at least it is. And CBO then includes employer-provided benefits, employer share of Social Security, Medicare, and all vouchers that people get in PNF, and Piketty and Sates don't. Another major factor to understand what's happening is household size. What we care about is standard of living. As we know from the poverty thresholds aren't the same. There's a one-person poverty threshold, a 2, 3, 4, 5, because poverty is a minimum standard of living. Similarly, 50,000 doesn't go as far if you're a single person as if you have a family of 4. The standard of living wouldn't be the same. Economists have simple ways to adjust this. There's a lot of debate on this, and a lot of it's focused on how you determine the poverty line of different sizes. It's very easy to do size adjustment at the bottom line. CBO does a size adjustment. Piketty and Sates don't. CBO uses a different price deflator. So if you've heard the thing about the chain CPI, it's coming your way. The chain CPI is coming your way. More and more people are talking about it, and basically it shows less inflation and more growth. So CBO basically uses a chain CPI.
You said chain?
Chained. Chained. Really what it has to do is it's very difficult to get a price deflator. This is not an easy thing because new goods are appearing. How you deal with new goods. Goods have different improvements, how you deal with the improvements, how you change the prices with improvements happening. And then the thing is, there's a thing called the substitution effect. The price of chicken goes down and the price of beef goes up, you'll switch. And there's a sense of trying to say that you'll switch because you can get more overall satisfaction by saving money on the choice between chicken and meat and use that money for something else. So it's chained has to do with the substitution effect, how you adjust for the substitution effect. Okay. All of this discussion actually isn't how people live their lives. All of these discussions are a comparison of structures, years apart. What is the middle person here to the middle person there? The top 1% person there to the top 1% person there to the bottom 20%. They're different people. In real life, people go through a life cycle. They start with low income. They increase their income very fast from their 20s into their mid-30s. They increase their income slowly from the mid-30s to the late 40s. They plateau, and they eventually move down. So when you hear all of this stuff of the median doesn't change, it sounds like most individual families aren't getting income gains. That's not true. Young people are, in fact, even in the there's some data in the thing about even in the middle of the recession, going from 2008 to 2012, about 40% of young people had income gains, while median income was going down. So there's a way that requires longitudinal data. So Piketty and Sates have this ridiculous number that was cited in the New York Times. They say between 2009 and 2012, 95% of the growth went to the top 1%. Okay? Between 2009 and 2012, 95% of the growth went to the top 1%. So what does that mean? What does it mean now that I just told you about this? It sounds like nobody got a raise. That's how various people like EPI would say, no one gets a raise. That's not true. Real people are getting raises, and real people are having income gains even in the middle of those bad years. What it means is that you look at the deltas. You get the average, the total income for the whole population, and you look at the deltas. And when the deltas are very small, it can have a very skewed effect. And any analysis of the deltas is dumb over 3 years. It never can be right. And anything that says 95% of the growth didn't understand their data, because what that is driven by is capital gains. So if you go into Piketty and Sates' raw data between 2009 and 2012, the income without capital gains grew by 0.3%, 0.3%. And if you go with capital gains, it grew by 6%. Capital gains are these lumpy things that people do as the housing market gets well. So let's say you're an upper middle class family with a household of $200,000, and you bought your house for $200,000 and you sell it for $750,000. Not an unreasonable thing. And you haven't sold it to 2012. Well, gee, all of a sudden your income that year is $600,000. So now you don't appear as being in the 200,000 group. You appear in the top 1%. And therefore, it's capital gains that drove this 95% of growth went to the top 1%. But it's cited over and over again.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, I have less than 5 to go.
Cool.
So I've given you a lot of data. And I'm a data-driven guy. Let's look at some polls. So in a world in which we don't have great data, polls, really you should do lots of polls, and they should look at the consistency of cross polls. One poll itself doesn't mean a whole lot. But Pew's done a lot of interesting things. So recently in 2010, although these are bad times, America will always continue to be prosperous and make economic progress. Do you agree or disagree? 63% said yes, 70% of young people said yes. These are young people who think that their future is terrible. A different poll done by Pew and is done by the General Social Survey has asked consistently, compared to your parents at the same age, do you live better, worse, or the same? Historically, it's been 65% better, 20% the same, 15% worse. In the middle of the recession in 2012, when things were that bad, it's 60% say better, 20% the same, 20% say worse. So people seem to think that. In a new poll by the Bank of America USA Today, 80% of young people said they expected to live as well or better than their parents. So this notion of dire straits that's accepted by the whole population, I would argue in a variety of polls, they don't show that. New York Times had a poll that said 64% believe that in America you could still start with low income and end up well off. And they thought that was a bad number. Because they thought it was a bad number because it was down from 70%. So they looked at the trend rather than the absolute number. So there's a lot of polls that show that people aren't exactly completely depressed. So in the end, and this is the conclusion, the Piketty book did not have the political effect that many expected, because inequality per se, Mr. Bertless has joined us. I'm sure he had a bad time in the subway. In the end, my conclusion. The Piketty book did not have the political effect that many expected, because inequality per se is a secondary or tertiary issue to most. A rhetoric that is based on the vast majority of people barely getting by is not likely to resonate widely. On the basis of fairness, many people will support raising the minimum wage. In principle, most are also for providing health insurance for everybody, but worry more about that it's the government that's doing it. And many think that the rich should pay more taxes while simultaneously not supporting the inheritance tax and want to lower business tax as well. It's a complex issue what people think about, but they aren't driven by deprivation and wanting to screw the top 1% because the 1% is screwing them. Thank you.
Gary, I've given you a glowing introduction in a few minutes, and you got a slides? But I'm going to go to, just to let you settle in here, let's go to Rui, and then Gary, you can finish it up. Go ahead, Rui.
Okay, all right. Thought I would go last. But,
Do you want to go last? Is it?
well, it may kind of, he just gave all the economic data, and Gary is the economist. I am not. So,
Gary, ready to jump in?
oh, sure.
All right. Okay. Turn your mic on, unless you want to jump up here, which you're welcome.
You talk about the need for infrastructure investment. It took an hour and a half to get 7 miles. I'm going to speak on the basis of what Steve wrote, not on the basis of what he said, as you can guess. He talks about 2 issues that are bothering the commentariat class, or at least the part that writes about economic affairs and family well-being. The first issue is what's been happening to the fortunes of the middle class. Is it really true that their fortunes have sagged as much as voters, op-ed writers, and editorial writers seem to believe? And the second issue is what's the deal with income disparities? Is it really the case that all the gains from our prosperity in the last 15 years, 20 years, whatever, has gone to the top 1%, leaving only crumbs for all the rest of us? I hope that Steve is going to succeed in getting a lot more people to listen to him. I hope he succeeds in persuading folks that middle-class fortunes have been improving over the past decade. Inequality has gone up, but it is not the case that all of the gains have gone to just 1% slice of the population. The rest of us have captured some of those gains too, including middle-class people. People who think middle-income living standards have stopped rising, if they're very well informed anyway, are thinking of living standards over a fairly brief period, that is, since the end of the last economic expansion in 2007. Alternatively, if they're thinking about living standards over 2 or 3 decades, they're only thinking about the trend in living standards within fairly narrow slices of the population. Unmarried men in their 20s and early 30s who've been have not had very much schooling, or groups that have been particularly hard hit in the recent slump. And there's no doubt that those folks have seen long-term stagnation or even losses in living standards. But Americans in the broad middle and at the bottom of the distribution have, on average, seen their real incomes climb over the last 15 years, over the last 30 years. So why is the claim that Steve makes and that I just made so controversial? Number one, a defective price index, which makes unwary observers think that real incomes are just climbing more slowly than they in fact are. Second, household income measures that fail to account for shrinking household size. If the median income has not changed in the last 30 years, and I'm not saying that's true, but if it were the case, shrinking family size would still mean that the average person in that household has seen real living standards climb because there's fewer of them to share the same income. Incomplete measures of income, in other words, definitions of income that exclude lots of the stuff with which we support ourselves, pay for our consumption. If we're using an incomplete measure of what we spend to enjoy our living standards, then we're going to miss something. Finally, inequality has unquestionably increased over the past 35 years, and this means that average living standards have improved faster than median living standards. Let me repeat. Inequality has, without any question, increased over the last 35 years. There's no doubt about that. The evidence is consistent, and so that means that the average has climbed faster than the median. More of the economy-wide income gains have been enjoyed by Americans at the top end of the distribution, but that doesn't mean there's nothing or even very little left for everyone else. Improvements in median living standards are continuing, at least if we take a long-term perspective. By that I mean anything longer than about 10 years. The plain fact is, however, that they have been improving more slowly since the year 2000 than they were in earlier post-war decades. And that is going to be especially true if we focus solely on the past, the years since the end of the last economic expansion. Under any plausible measure of Americans' income or consumption possibilities, gains in middle-class living standards have been slower since 2000 than they were before that. And it's hard to put, let's be clear, it's very hard to put a happy face on a 13 or 14-year-old period that has been punctuated with the worst post-war slump and a weak economic recovery, period. You can't make those numbers disappear, and that's going to be true at the top end as well as the middle and at the bottom. I brought 9 slides, and let's see if any of them come up. It's either a PDF file or, if you want, it's a PowerPoint slide.
Is there a title? There's many on.
Well, there's only one in the root directory, right? Okay, forget it.
He's gonna get to the slide.
Do you want me to do it?
It's funny. When I was coming down on the metro, I actually heard a lot of people talking about the change CPI. You talked about how it's kind of coming, and it's like on everybody's lips.
Okay.
Just a little comic relief there.
So
I'm still waiting for that first conversation I had to hear about.
let me talk first about the defective price measure and the changing household size. All of the numbers that I'm about to mention are based on the Census Bureau's estimates of the trend in median pre-tax household cash income, because those are the numbers that everyone pays attention to. Those are the numbers that are reported when people say there's been no improvement in living standards since the mid-1990s. So, first calculation, since 1980, how much has median income risen for that measure of income? 4%. So over the years from 1980 to 2013, 4% gain. Suppose we consistently use the BLS's current measure of price increase. It's called the CPI-U research series. Well, then the median income has increased 9%. Well, suppose we substitute a defective measure of price change, the CPI-U, for what the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Department of Commerce uses, the personal consumption expenditure deflator. Well, using that measure, the gain since 1980 in median household income has been 20%. And now suppose we say, well, how much has income per person in the median family increased, adjusting for the fact that there are fewer people in the family to share the income. And that number is 30%. So at the low end, it looks like it's 4% gain since 1980, and at the high end, it's 30%. In each case, it should be clear which is the preferable measure of price change, what is the preferable measure of the living standard that can be supported, given the fact that we're talking about household incomes. But there's no way we can get away from the fact that the gains in all of these income measures have been slower since 2000 than they were in the years before. Now, everybody knows that income inequality has gone up. So people at the top of the distribution have seen faster gains than people at the bottom. The best known indication of this, the one that's most widely reported, is what is the income share of people in the top 1% of the income distribution. These numbers have been tabulated by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. They use Internal Revenue Service data on tax filing units, and they calculate the total cash market incomes received by the top 1% compared with their estimate of what's happened to incomes in general under that income definition. And those calculations suggest that the share of income going to the top 1% had risen from a historical average between 1960 and 1980 of about 8% of all cash market incomes up to 19% of market income in the most most recent year that they analyzed, which is 2012. So what are the problems with this number? Well, it's gross pre-tax income, so it disregards the taxes people pay. But a rising share of the income that people receive is not market income at all. It's government transfer income. Government transfer income has increased from about 1% of income in 1930 to 20% of income in the most recent years. The other thing it disregards is the kind of income that we receive in the form of somebody else paying our bills for us. That doesn't count as our cash income, but nonetheless we are deriving consumption from people reimbursing our bills for us. And the most spectacular example of this is health insurance. I think only about 1/4 of the cost of health care in the United States comes from the direct out-of-pocket payments of American households. The rest of it is financed by our employers through their subsidies of our premiums, and by the federal government or state governments in Medicaid and Medicare. And the share of that income, the share of our personal income that comes in that form, has more than doubled since 1980. The increase in the fraction of our income that consists of government reimbursement of health bills, mainly through Medicare and Medicaid, but also now through Obamacare insurance subsidies, has changed not just what the middle class person is receiving as consumption, but it's also changed the distribution. And why is that? Well, think for a moment about getting your medical bills paid. I think the average outlays on medical care in the United States per year, per person, is a little over $9,000. And as I said before, 3/4 of that is not paid for out of pocket. It's paid for by somebody else. Now, who receives that money? Well, it turns out that this money has a much more egalitarian distribution in the population than does other sources of income. If we pay for operation received by a poor person, it is a very big proportional increase in the income of that poor person. But the way to look at this is not the way I just described it, but instead to think of it as an insurance plan that is paying for your expected medical bills. And it turns out that those medical bills are proportionately a bigger share of the incomes of low income than of middle income people, and a bigger share of middle income people income than it is high income people. So it matters both for thinking about what's happening to the median, because as more and more income is not counted in these statistics measured by the IRS, measured by Census Bureau, and also this kind of income is much more equally distributed in the population. So healthcare consumption has increased sharply over the past 30 years. The share of healthcare financed with somebody else's money, either your employers or the government, has increased steadily over time. None of this is counted in standard income statistics, either Piketty and Saez's or in the Census Bureau's. And the increase in government subsidies for insurance is much more economically significant for lower and middle income families than it is for top income recipients. Now, it's worth asking the question, how should we value all this spending? And I have to say there are a lot of progressives who say, oh, that's okay, we can disregard this money, that's perfectly fine. But that's not what they say when they are urging their legislators to provide health insurance to people who cannot afford health insurance. So either it's important and we should fight for this as an important component of our income, or we should concede that the Census Bureau and the IRS, when they're measuring incomes of people, are perfectly on solid ground and completely disregarding this. Well, there's still an unhappy bottom line, no matter how you slice the statistics. A 13-year period that's punctuated by the worst economic downturn and a very slow recovery is not going to look very good. And this doesn't matter really whether you're measuring income using a comprehensive income definition or these more narrow definitions. The plain fact is, since 2000, income gains, consumption gains, gains in real consumption have been slower, and that is, and that's, I think, what weighs on the op-ed writers, the commentary class. Steve Rose is correct in both of his major points. U.S. productivity gains have delivered living standard improvements to middle-income families, contrary to popular belief. Just because people are not aware of them simply indicates they're using a measure of income that does not cover all of the income that's paying for their consumption. The comprehensive income numbers also imply that low-income Americans have actually fared proportionately better since the year 2000 compared with the top income class, and the middle income people have also done a little bit better because the incomes of low and middle income people have been better protected in proportional terms against the downturns that they experienced in the Great Recession.
Great, thank you. Rui.
You're up. So after that refreshing bath and the data, let me comment without reference to too much of the actual economic data. Now, Steve's thesis can be very radically summarized as, if you look at the behavior of the economy in the last 30 or 40 years, or even the last 10 or 15 years, there's less inequality than people think there is, less of a rise in inequality. And there's been more of a rise in living standards than a certain conventional wisdom has it, a conventional wisdom fueled by Piketty and Sayce's work and that of others. And more specifically, if you look beyond pre-tax money income, you take into account life cycle effects, you take into account household size effects, and you use a better price deflator, like things look better. You know, they look better. And I'm not really qualified to comment on the exact deconstruction of the data that's in Steve's paper, and a lot of what Gary alluded to. Nevertheless, I think there's a there. And what it helps us do is look beyond not only what the commentary says, not only what you see in the papers, but also, let's face it, when you ask people about their income, when you ask survey questions about people's household income, exit polls, political survey, any kind of survey, what people think of is their pre-tax money income. They don't think of this broader definition. They don't think of the household size issue. They don't think of price deflators. Despite my joke earlier, I've actually never heard anyone talk about a price deflator on the subway. So, you know, the conventional wisdom in that sense matches up pretty well with the way people tend to think about income, but what we're learning here is that this isn't the entire story. The story is more complicated than that. So even though I'm not qualified to judge the specifics of what Steve has put forward, I do think there's something to it. I do think that it seems reasonable on this basis, taking these things into account, that things aren't quite as bad as people tend to think they are. That if we look over the last 15 years, but even the last 15 years, but especially the last 30 or 40 years, some progress has actually been made by normal, everyday, average people. It's not just the rich that have benefited from the way the economy has evolved in the last 30 to 35 years. That's just not the case. So I buy that, though I think how we estimate that change, you could argue about exactly what mix of this kind of brew of deflators and life cycle effects and household size effects we feel is the real true representation of how people have really done. Let's just leave that aside and stipulate there's been more good stuff happening than has been given credit for in the papers. Okay, what are the implications of this? I think the implications is that people may not recognize themselves in the more florid descriptions of our economic problems, that some of the take that we're given on the way the middle class has fared is excessively pessimistic, that it's not really that plausible in terms of how people have lived their lives, and it's certainly not inspirational to them. I mean, if anything, it probably just makes people feel hopeless, the way it's presented to them. And in a way, it's almost like at times you feel like with some of the more intense descriptions of the problems of the middle class, it's sort of like Marx's absolute immiseration of the proletariat. It's kind of like the great mass of people are being pressed down by the weight of capital and ground into the dirt because of the sort of the intrinsic dynamics of the capitalist system. I think that has not been a great argument over the years for people on the left. It never really took, and I don't think it's likely to take today. Now that said, there's no question, as Steve has said and Gary has just emphasized, that inequality has in fact risen in the United States over the last 30 to 35 years. And the growth in living standards, economic growth in general, has been relatively slow. And there really is a great deal of discontent about that, and particularly how poorly things have been in the last 10 or 15 years. People do in fact believe that inequality has gone up substantially. They do in fact believe that the system essentially is stacked to favor the wealthy. They do believe that as middle class people are strapped in this country and they have increased economic insecurity and problems. They do believe that mobility is harder than it used to be. This is what people believe. I mean, I'm not saying that what people believe is absolutely correct, but there is discontent out there. People are worried. People don't feel their route to improve in life is as good as it used to be. They feel there are a lot of problems. So the question then becomes, how do you deal with this politically, or at least that's one of the questions we all ask here in Washington. How can you connect to these sentiments of discontent about the economy and what's producing for ordinary people without indulging in alarmism and without sort of putting forward an excessively pessimistic view of what the economy has done and what it's capable of that may in fact, sort of, in a sense, distance you from people rather than connect to them, because it doesn't sound realistic. Well, I think one implication is that you can't simply talk about inequality. That if you simply focus on the issue of inequality per se, and you don't talk about anything else really, that will unlikely to be in and of itself enough to really animate people and connect to people. There's a necessity to link a discussion of inequality, which again, people do believe exists, and people do believe is a problem, and people do believe the system's unfair, to the question of opportunity and to the question of their aspirations, because that's really what people care about. The people care about their ability to get ahead in life, to provide for their family, and to have a relatively secure lifestyle. This is what people want. They don't necessarily wake up in the morning and say, I really want to change the Gini coefficient in the United States. It's just really bothering me how high it is these days, and we really got to get it down by 10 basis points or something. That's not going to happen. So I think the right way to pitch this to people is that what we really want is an economy that works for everyone, not just the people at the top, or not more or excessively much for people at the top. There's a lot of polling data that suggests that's really what people want. They don't want to see, they're not waking up in the morning and thinking about redistribution, and they're not waking and thinking about how bad inequality is per se, but they are very worried about their ability to get ahead, and they think things are stacked against them. So you have to connect to that. And I think this is, I'm not sure Steve touched on this, but I think it was implicit in his remarks and those of others, that one reason why we can't just talk about inequality and we can't just talk about those kinds of relationships is that what people want is an economy that's growing relatively fast, where living standards are going up relatively fast, and where there's full employment, it's easy to get a job and wages are going up. These are things that really matter for people, and the problem is, how do you convince people, how do you reach people with the idea that this is possible and link it to a program that might actually be able to make some progress in that direction? I think that's a difficult question. It's not an easy, especially if you're coming from a left perspective, a progressive perspective. A lot of the things you may think work involve government taking a more active role. They involve spending money. They involve lots of things that are a little bit of a hard sell for a lot of people in the public, including particularly, this is another longer story, but people who are non-college educated have actually fared the worst in the last 30 or 40 years. Sometimes are the people most skeptical of government, particularly if they are white. But that's another another story. So let me just leave it there. As you know, I really appreciate what Steve has done and what Gary has done too, in terms of clarifying for us the nuances of the economic picture that we have, and the nuances of how people have really experienced the economy in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I think this is very instructive for both people on the right and people on the left, and I think that perspective needs to be integrated in the way we think about what people are feeling, what they're thinking, what they're wanting, and how politics is going to evolve in the future. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So why don't we open it up for questions, folks? Yes, sir. We'll go here and then here.
I'm Stan Sorsher. I'm with SPIA. It's an engineering union in the aerospace industry. You're going to hold? I got it. Okay. Stephen Rose made one offhand comment that I jotted down here. I wanted to think about a little bit. If you have $1 billion income or some insanely high, incomprehensibly high income, it doesn't change your lifestyle. It sure doesn't change your lifestyle, but it gives you a lot of political and social power that other people don't have. And I'm relieved that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about productivity, because I think the real issue here is power relationships, the power to divide the gains, right? And we can argue about whether the gains are divided, badly or really badly, but the cause issue here is the power relationships. Who has the power to decide how we divide gains? So Rui was kind of getting toward that. Because that's what people feel. They feel at risk and contingent and insecure, powerless, while everybody else, or not everybody else, the people who are making political decisions have increased their political power. So it's not a matter of productivity or really the economics, it's the politics and the sociology. And then it's much easier to understand the electoral issue if it takes $1 billion to run for president and both candidates need the $1 billion. There's not going to be that much difference between the two candidates. It's the power relationships that are always set. Tammany, the New York politician, said, "I don't really care who votes as long as I get to decide who's running." Right? I mean, that's a political issue.
Yeah, there's no question that money in politics is gone crazed, and there's no question they have political power. I guess as somebody who's been involved in lots of campaigns, it doesn't explain why the D's have done so badly. I really do believe that people are making calculuses and people have concerns. The power people said don't raise the minimum wage, and the people, even Republicans, voted for it. I mean, it's not a one-way street here, and that it's just tough to get. What I'm trying to say is the following. I think economics says that it's not that people are so screwed that their interests are Democrats. What I'm saying here is this economy is so productive relative to the past. And Galbraith talked about the affluent society in 1957, when we have GDP per capita that is nearly 3 times larger. So I'm just saying that people are weighing different things, and relying on an appeal to how badly they are doing has not resonated widely enough because of other things. And that we need, and I think Rui was saying how difficult it is to try to craft this message, because it does, most of what government does now today is 50% of what all government spending is, and 60% at the federal level, are transfer payments. Okay, most government spending now, we've really changed from being pro-defense to being this ability to support non-workers and give people who are in the lower income more money, more resources. That's a great success, but it means that they're not that interested in seeing more of it or whatever. I mean, so yes, power is unequal, but I don't think that explains the politics.
Right here, and then here, and here. Let go, and then here, and then here.
Joe Kennedy with ITIF. So there's this residual increase in inequality in your numbers. I'm wondering how much of that, if any, do you think is caused by the rise of pass-through entities after the 1986 tax reform? Because I see that argument made a lot, that a lot of this is, a lot of the increasing inequality is that people at the higher end shifted from owning or running corporations to running like sub-S corporations or partnerships because the tax rates were lower.
I'll let Gary comment also on this, but I don't think it's a big factor. I mean, I think it's driven by their pay packages are just much bigger, and there's been shifting, especially in a long past when income tax rates were so high and there was so much attention to shifting it. But I don't think the recent shifts have had a big effect on inequality.
If you look at the Piketty and Saez numbers, or just IRS numbers by themselves, you'll see that there was a huge jump in the share of income going to the top 10%, connected to the 1986 tax reform law. The fact that the percentage of pre-tax cash income going to the top 1% increased, I think, 4.5 percentage points in the space of 2 years. And there's a very straightforward explanation for that. In the old days, it used to be sensible for people to leave their money inside of corporations, where the money would be more lightly taxed and it would be more or less a voluntary tax, because they only paid taxes when they realized capital gains and took their money out, to a system in which incomes, if they reorganized as subchapter S corporations, would only be taxed once at the individual level, and so it began to be received in this form. So I think that explains the big jump at the tail end of the 1980s, but you cannot explain the increase since about 1989 in this way. But this is maybe a third of the total, I would say.
Okay. Jack?
Hi, I'm Jack Wells, retired transportation economist. I certainly agree with most of what Steve has said in his paper, though I have a little skepticism about the change CPI. But one of the things I think we need to think about more is Steve emphasized the different definitions of income and came down strongly in favor of a comprehensive definition of income that includes transfers and capital gains and so on. I think we have different purposes for defining income, and I think there may be appropriately different definitions of income for different purposes. For example, I think there is an interest in figuring out how the private economy divides up income, in addition to how the ultimate resources are divided up when you take into account transfers and other non-cash forms of income. I think there's an interest in how the distribution of income, what the distribution of income is among the working population, sort of leaving out people who are retired and people who are students. And I think one of the things that we need to give a lot more attention to is the issue that you emphasized of not necessarily life cycle income, but longer term definitions of income. I think people don't necessarily think about their income over their entire life cycle, because the entire life cycle is a long way into the distance, but they certainly think in terms of 5-year periods and what their average income is expected to be over a 5-year period. And I think trying to incorporate some sense of that into our concept of income would be an important thing to do, to have more useful data on this.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of sympathy for those comments. And if Piketty and Saez had limited their analysis to prime age working people and then made arguments on the basis of that, fine. But they're including 20% of their households, and then they're taking their income away. So that's a real bias downward. And the bottom line, as Gary noted, is that healthcare, in 1960, healthcare was 5% of GDP, and now it's 17% of GDP. And there are benefits that we're getting, and we aren't paying for it directly. So you see, it all depends on what you're trying to do, and that I don't think you can wipe that off the table when it's so important, and it employs 20% of the economy. It's like saying it doesn't count. And so, and it also depends on how you want to use the arguments. There's a funny aside in this, and that is I contacted Emmanuel Sayce. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways. About 10 years ago, when they first started doing this stuff, and said, this stuff is being used like this. And he showed me how his stuff was really done. Right? There was all this stuff at the end. And he said, it really shouldn't be used for the bottom 90%. We really only did it for the top 1%. But then he got front page story after front page story in the New York Times. And he said, oh, this is fun. I think I'll present it a little more. And it's just the negativity that people, there's a left echo chamber that focuses on a kind of negativity because they believe you've got to prove the system's broke. And that's going to rally people to their side, and I don't think it's been successful. So in general, as an analytic tool, sure, you should be careful and careful all those things you said, but this is really, there's a lot more here at stake.
Yeah, it doesn't just rally people to your side, it gets you really good book contracts. No, I'm really quite serious. I see that constantly, I'm going to sound like an old fogey, but when I got my PhD, there was an ethos that you were supposed to strive for objectivity. Now, everybody recognizes in academia back then that you couldn't get it, but you would strive for it. And I think we've abandoned that for many, many academics today, because what they're striving for is, can I get on 60 Minutes? Can I get a TED Talk? And can I sell my books all around the world? And you don't do that if you come out with a paper that says, oh, income inequality is growing a little bit, but it's not as bad as we think, and there's 9 other factors for that. I mean, Steve is not going to get a TED Talk out of this. I'm sorry to say, Steve. I hope you will. I hope you will. So right back here.
The whole dialogue in the last, James saying, the whole dialogue in the last conversation reminded me of the famous line from Looking Glass between Humpty Dumpty and the Red Queen. The Humpty Dumpty being the words mean exactly what I say, and the Red Queen saying, can words mean that many different things? Yesterday, Gary's shop ran a very nice seminar on uncertainty in policy making. And of course, I always viewed uncertainty in terms of actually bad data or statistical errors or systematic errors, but this discussion also points out that uncertainty in policymaking actually also includes conflicting definitions of words. And I was wondering if you would like to make any comments on how this basically distorts the whole dialogue.
Well, I had a conversation yesterday with Mike Fletcher at the Post, asking me the question, so I really like a lot of your data and you've done it before. How come the other side's won so much? How come it's become conventional wisdom, as people are saying? And I think it's a combination of things. So when I first started doing this, and it was on Rui's website, I wrote a piece that said, I had a sentence that said, it's just an occupational hazard of those with big hearts to see problems. That is, a lot of our biases are based on, a lot of our different data approaches are based on a certain orientation, and therefore we fit data into that orientation. And because people want to see to make change, number one. Number two, good news is boring. So journalists have a big interest in presenting bad news. I mean, I once saw a study that in bad times, economic bad stories outnumber good stories 10 to 1. In good times, it's 7 to 1. That is, it's just boring. And so therefore, journalists win Pulitzers by doing these You know, the Philadelphia did a book on it, and I do a law journalist, and that is, it's got pathos. Does this have pathos? You know, it's got anti-pathos or whatever, you know, and so there's just a lot of reasons, and what we see in so many polls over and over again is this notion of out there, overall economy is not doing that well. I don't like the legislators in general, but I go for my own. And actually in schools, people say the schools are doing a terrible job. They actually do consistent polling of people on schools, and 90% like their schools. I mean, it's a really bizarre finding. So you see, there's all these perception, and in a world that's crazed, you can have a lot of, in general, negativity. So psychologists have come up with this thing that we are more prone to negativity than positivity. And it's a very easy thing when you look at evolution. So it's called fight or flee, stay or flee. You know, if you make a mistake that a lion is not there, that noise in the brush is not a lion, and you run away, there's no cost. If you make the other mistake, that, oh, it's just a noise out there, and it turns out to be a lion, you know, that's not a very good. So, I mean, we actually do, I mean, psychologists, there's a guy named Jonathan Haidt who's written a lot about this, that we also have a bias towards negativity in general.
Steve, to that point, though, you know, people arguing that the human race is still evolving, and we haven't evolved in 30 years in any serious way. So that bias, that bias toward negativity has always been there. But this problem has not always been there. Now, partly you could argue maybe because the economy was doing better, but it seems to me that something else has happened here, so that the bad narrative around automation is dominant. The bad narrative around productivity now is dominant. That something else is going on.
I think there is something going on, and that has to do with our parents, and it has to do with the 1950s for a lot of people. I mean, so let's talk about some history. You know, 1930 sucked, right, for people. You know, that's pretty clear. And then they had the war, and then the 50s happened. And the economy changed, and, you know, it was the 30 golden years is what the French call it. So what happened as a lot of us became adults and as the older adults came is that relative to what appeared before, it wasn't that sense of just complete. And what I would argue is those 30 years are the exception, and this is much more the rule. That, you know, and then there's just the hyperconnectivity is also another thing that just makes it more. But
Roy, did you want to jump on that?
Yeah, no, I think there's truth to the idea that people measure the current period against the previous period, the experience of their parents, maybe experience when they were growing up or what they read about. I think that is a factor. I think also, I mean, in an even broader sense, I think we're in a transitional period between sort of the old mass production industrial economy to a post-industrial services economy, which produced a lot of dislocation. I mean, it has produced a lot of change that scares people, particularly people with relatively low amounts of education. It's not the case that, you know, as a non-college educated person, you're on a particularly delightful career track at this point. The high-paying, relatively low-skilled jobs are somewhat scarcer than they used to be. It's not that they're not high-paying jobs out there, but it's harder to get them at any rate with less education. And I think all of this kind of funnels into people's view of the economy. So I think there's a reality behind people's feelings of insecurity and lack of progress that this narrative feeds into. Now the narrative it's like an amplifier. It takes those feelings of unease and anxiety and dislocation, and it sort of attaches them, and it expands them, it amplifies them into this broader, immiseration of the proletariat kind of rap about what's happened in America. Middle class people are making a nickel more than they did 40 years ago. Of course, that's not true, but it does connect to some real feelings.
Can I make an observation on this measurement issue? We can think of two areas of life where I don't think that there's actually very much doubt about what the trends have been over the last 35 or 40 years. One is crime. it's still the case that a plurality of Americans think the crime rate is rising. If there's one thing that is easy to disprove with statistics, surveys, have you been the victim of a crime, which have been conducted since the early 1970s, and statistics on serious crime, we know that this is completely wrong. In fact, there have been fairly sizable declines in crime in the United States, and it's apparently unknown to a plurality of respondents to Gallup polls. I mean, there was a brief period when it was in the news that crime rate was declining so surprisingly and much, and for a while, pluralities thought that the crime rate was declining. But even though crime rates continue to decline, the public still thinks crime rates are rising. Okay, that's one thing. Health. You know, I don't know what you can tell people that says, you know, you live longer, you're in better health when you're in your 60s and 70s, but people do not perceive that as part of improved living standards. I don't know why not, but they think it's their due. They don't see the bad ends or the bad chronic conditions that they have avoided. So they give no credit to all this money that society and they personally, through taxes, through accepting lower pay in exchange for more health insurance benefits, are paying for. They're paying for something and they're getting it. Maybe not as efficiently as the French are getting it or the Swedes are getting it, but they're getting it. They're getting it in many different forms, and they don't recognize it because a lot of the things that they're avoiding are rare events that make spectacularly big differences, like a child who survives leukemia who 30 years ago would have died of exactly that disease, or people who don't get deadly complications from serious disease. Nonetheless, if you don't add these things in, then some of the things that society is spending money on, and people personally are spending money on, even though they don't recognize it, that are generating improvements for them, they don't register and they don't get counted as an improvement in living standards. They look at this one number, which Piketty and Saez will tell them, which the Census Bureau will tell them, and say, things are getting worse, and it's not encapsulating how actually their gross incomes are being spent.
So I promised we'd stop at 10:30, and we're now a minute over, so we're going to be 2 minutes over because I just want to wrap up with one comment. I think there's sort of two ways to think about what's happened over the last 30 years. There's one way, which is the dominant way now, which is almost all of that growth has been wasted, and it's going to the people who buy that watch in the New York Times magazine. Why should we work for advancement, progress, and growth? I think there's a second way, which is to say, look, over the last 30 years, if you compare that to this point Steve's talking about, 47 to 77, what you saw was productivity growth rates almost twice as high in that period as in the last 30 years. So perhaps that could be part of the challenge. We simply have not been able to raise productivity. And the second big difference is what Gary alluded to, is we now have a vast number of people who are not working, not because they can't get a job, because they don't want a job. In other words, they're old. And
wait a minute.
Retirement hasn't gone up? So to the point of 20% now, a large share of income has shifted from workers to retirees, and therefore after-tax income for working people is going to be less than it would be had all those people, had that factor not changed. So I think the part of this whole story is about a narrative. It's about a narrative whether we say we still want growth, we still want the policy changes in the U.S. that would get us more robust growth, or we're going to say, no, we don't really want to do that, we're just going to be focusing on distribution. And I think to me, what Steve's report is so important about is saying, look, yes, income inequality has gone up, yes, we need policies to continue to address that, like higher taxes on wealthy people. But if we give up on growth at the same time, basically we're not going to get where we need to go. So please join me in thanking a great panel, and thank you all.